At first, I thought it was love finding its way back to me. My sister had started visiting more often. She would call unexpectedly, show up at my door with a soft smile, ask how I was doing. Sometimes she brought coffee. Sometimes she stayed longer than usual. She listened. She laughed. She acted like she finally cared, and I wanted to believe it. Because when someone you grew up with suddenly shows interest in your life, you don't question it. You don't analyze every word. You don't look for traps. You tell yourself, maybe things are changing. Maybe time healed what distance broke. I was wrong. Every visit followed the same pattern, though I didn't notice it at first. The conversation always drifted slowly, carefully, toward my life, my work, my income, my plans, how busy I was, how much pressure I carried, how strong I seemed. She would nod. Ask questions. Pretend to worry. You work too much, she'd say. You don't have to handle everything alone. I just want to make sure you're okay. It sounded like concern. It felt like concern. But something always came after. A story about her struggles, a bill she hadn't expected, a problem that just came up, a situation that needed help quickly. Not much, she'd say. Just until things settled. Just this once. And because she was my sister, I helped. The first time, it felt natural. Family helps family. The second time, it felt uncomfortable, but still reasonable. By the third time, it felt expected. What I didn't realize was that she wasn't coming to see me. She was checking inventory. She remembered details about my finances better than I did. She knew when I got paid. She noticed when I upgraded something, my phone, my car, my apartment. She asked casual questions that didn't feel casual anymore. Business going well? You seem more stable lately. You're doing better than most of us. There was something cold behind the warmth, something measuring. But every time doubt crept in, I pushed it away. Because admitting the truth meant admitting something unbearable, that my own sister might see me not as family, but as a resource. Then one night, she stayed longer than usual. We were sitting in silence when she sighed and said, almost casually, you've always been the responsible one. It didn't sound like a compliment. It sounded like a justification. She looked around my place, slowly, took it in. Then she smiled and said something that made my stomach drop. I'm so glad you're doing well. It makes things easier. Easier for who? That was the moment something shifted inside me. A quiet realization I didn't want to face. All the visits, all the conversations, all the timing. None of it was random. She hadn't been reconnecting. She had been assessing. And suddenly, the warmth felt rehearsed. The concern felt strategic. The affection felt conditional. I replayed every visit in my head and saw the pattern clearly for the first time. She didn't come when I was struggling. She didn't come when I needed support. She came when I was stable, when I was solvent, when I could give. She wasn't visiting me. She was collecting. And the worst part? I don't think she ever believed she was doing anything wrong. Because when family uses you, they don't call it exploitation. They call it entitlement. And by the time you realize the truth, they've already taken more than money. Once the pattern revealed itself, I couldn't unsee it. Every memory rearranged itself in my mind, forming a picture I had spent years avoiding. My sister hadn't suddenly changed. I had. And the moment my life began to stabilize, she appeared, not out of concern, not out of love, but out of opportunity. Growing up, we were never close in the way people imagine siblings should be. There was always a quiet distance between us, an unspoken competition I didn't understand until much later. She needed attention. I learned to disappear. She needed validation. I learned to be reliable. Somewhere along the way, those roles hardened into identities. I became the responsible one. She became the one who always needed help. At first, it was small: borrowed money, favors, promises to pay me back when things improved. And because I believed in family loyalty, I never asked questions. I never set limits. I told myself it was temporary, that she would find her footing. But time passed and nothing changed. What did change was her entitlement. She stopped asking. She started assuming. If I hesitated, she reminded me of everything we'd been through growing up. If I said no, she accused me of forgetting where I came from. Gratitude became a weapon. Guilt became leverage. She knew exactly which words to use. You've always had it easier. You don't know what it's like to struggle. I'd do it for you. That last one haunted me because it wasn't true. When I struggled, she was absent. When I was overwhelmed, she was busy. When I needed support, she vanished. But when I had something to give, she was always there, always present, always watching. I began noticing how her visits aligned with my milestones: a promotion, a successful project, a financial breakthrough I hadn't even shared publicly yet. Somehow, she always knew. She asked questions that crossed boundaries, then laughed them off when I looked uncomfortable. She commented on my lifestyle in ways that felt like subtle audits. Nothing overt, nothing obvious, just enough to remind me that she was paying attention. It felt less like family and more like surveillance. The hardest part was admitting my role in all of it. I had trained her to see me this way by never pushing back, by always giving in, by confusing generosity with obligation. I believed love meant sacrifice. She believed sacrifice was my job. And the more I gave, the less human I became in her eyes. I wasn't her sibling anymore. I was her safety net, her fallback plan, her solution. When I finally tried to draw a line, everything changed. The warmth vanished, the calls slowed, the visits stopped. Silence replaced familiarity. And for a moment, I thought maybe that was the end of it. Maybe she had moved on. Maybe I had finally protected myself. But what I didn't understand was this. People who see you as a resource don't let go quietly. They wait. Weeks later, she reached out again, her voice softer than ever. She told me she was in trouble, real trouble. She said she had no one else. She said she trusted me more than anyone. I felt the old guilt rise in my chest, the old conditioning, the fear of being the bad sibling, the selfish one, the one who abandoned family. So I listened. And that's when she crossed a line I didn't know existed, because this time it wasn't just about money. It was about access, control, entitlement taken to its final form. She didn't just want help. She wanted authority over my decisions, over my finances, over my future. And when I refused, when I finally said no without apology, her reaction wasn't disappointment. It was anger. Cold, calculated, personal. That was the moment I understood something devastating. She didn't see my boundaries as limits. She saw them as betrayal. And betrayal, in her mind, required consequences. What came next wasn't a request. It wasn't a conversation. It was a move designed to punish me for no longer being useful. And by the time I realized what she was capable of, it was already too late. Because when entitlement turns into resentment, and resentment turns into strategy, family becomes the most dangerous enemy.
Looking back, I can see the pattern forming long before I ever had the language to describe it. It didn't begin with money. That's the lie people tell themselves when they don't want to confront something deeper. It began with roles quiet, invisible assignments handed out in childhood and reinforced over time until they felt natural, inevitable. In our family, my sister was always the one in crisis, and I was always the one expected to cope. No one ever said it out loud. They didn't need to. When something went wrong, eyes turned to me. When something needed fixing, my name was mentioned casually, as if responsibility had always belonged to me. If my sister failed, there were explanations. If I hesitated, there were expectations. That imbalance didn't feel unfair back then. It felt normal. I learned early that being reliable earned approval. Being low maintenance earned peace. I learned that needs were inconvenient, but solutions were admirable. So I became a solution. My sister, on the other hand, learned something else entirely. She learned that distress brought attention, that urgency softened boundaries, that someone else, usually me, would step in before consequences arrived. She learned that there was always a net beneath her, and she never needed to ask how it was built. By the time we were adults, those childhood dynamics had hardened into a system. At first, her requests were framed as temporary setbacks, a late bill, a missed paycheck, a small favor to get her through a rough patch. Each time, she assured me it was the last time. Each time, I believed her. Not because the story was convincing, but because the alternative felt cruel. I didn't want to be the sibling who said no. I told myself that helping her didn't cost me anything, that I was strong enough to absorb it. That family loyalty meant stepping up, even when it was inconvenient. What I didn't realize was that I was teaching her something every time I complied. I was teaching her that my boundaries were negotiable. The amounts grew slowly, almost imperceptibly. What began as emergency help turned into expectation. She stopped explaining in detail. She stopped apologizing. She stopped promising repayment. Instead, she began narrating her problems as if the solution was already implied. I don't know how I'm going to cover this. I wish I had someone I could rely on. You're lucky you don't have to deal with this kind of stress. The words weren't demands. They didn't need to be. The pressure was embedded in the implication. If I didn't step in, I wasn't just saying no to money, I was saying no to her survival. That framing was deliberate. I noticed, over time, that she never mentioned her problems to anyone else in front of me. I was the designated audience, the designated responder. And when I helped, she would relax instantly, as if the crisis had never existed at all. That should have worried me. It didn't. What worried me more was how easily she adapted her tone depending on my reaction. When I agreed quickly, she was warm, grateful, almost affectionate. When I hesitated, her voice hardened. The warmth disappeared, replaced by something sharp and transactional. You know I'd do the same for you. I guess I know where I stand. I thought family mattered to you. Those words were never shouted. They were delivered calmly, efficiently, like tools placed on a table, each one designed to produce a specific outcome, and they worked. I began to dread our conversations not because I didn't love my sister, but because I never knew what version of her I would get. The appreciative one, the wounded one, or the quietly resentful one who made me feel like I owed her something I could never fully repay. It wasn't just money anymore. It was emotional access. She wanted to know details about my life that didn't concern her: my income, my savings, my plans. When I shared too little, she accused me of being secretive. When I shared too much, she stored the information away, ready to use later. She remembered everything. If I mentioned a bonus in passing, she referenced it weeks later. If I said work was going well, she assumed availability. My success, in her mind, was communal property, something to be redistributed when she deemed it necessary. And because I didn't challenge that belief early, it grew roots. I began noticing how she framed my achievements not as results of effort, but as proof that I had excess, that I had room, that I could afford to help again. "You're doing fine," she would say, dismissively, whenever I mentioned stress. "You don't have real problems," she added once, without irony. That sentence lingered longer than she realized. It was the first time I understood that my struggles didn't register as real to her. They were inconveniences at best, obstacles to her access at worst. My role wasn't to live my own life fully, it was to remain stable enough to support hers. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly. In moments of discomfort, I pushed aside a joke that landed wrong, a comment that revealed entitlement instead of gratitude, a look of irritation when I set a boundary, however small. Still, I kept helping. Part of me believed that if I just held on a little longer, something would change. That one day she would stabilize. That one day she would stop needing me. That one day the balance would correct itself. What I didn't understand was that dependence doesn't dissolve on its own. it consolidates. The more reliable I became, the more she reorganized her life around my availability. She made decisions assuming my support. She took risks because I absorbed consequences. She resented me not for helping too little but for reminding her, simply by existing, that she relied on me. Dependence, I learned, breeds a very specific kind of anger. Not toward the system that failed you, but toward the person who makes your weakness visible. I began to sense it in her tone of quiet irritation whenever I talked about independence, future plans, or long-term goals that didn't include her. She listened less, interrupted more, redirected the conversation back to herself. My life was only interesting to her when it could be leveraged. The shift became undeniable the first time I said no. It wasn't even a firm refusal, just a pause, a request for time. I explained that I had commitments that I couldn't help right now, that I needed to prioritize my own stability. Her response wasn't disappointment. It was offense. The conversation ended abruptly. The warmth vanished instantly, and in the silence that followed, I felt something new, something colder than guilt. I felt retaliation taking shape. That was the moment I should have paid attention. The moment I should have recognized that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system under threat, and systems don't collapse quietly. They adapt, they escalate, they punish resistance. I didn't know it yet, but the moment I stopped being useful, I became something else entirely in her eyes. I became a problem, and problems, I would soon learn, are meant to be solved by any means necessary. The silence after that first refusal was louder than any argument we had ever had. Days passed without a message, then weeks, no casual check-ins, no late-night calls, no sudden visits. At first, I felt relief. A lightness I hadn't realized I was missing. For the first time in a long while, my life felt like it belonged to me again. But that relief didn't last, because people who lose access rarely accept it quietly. They don't grieve the relationship. They strategize how to regain control. When my sister finally reached out again, her tone was different, softer, measured, almost professional. She apologized for being distant. Said she'd been doing a lot of thinking, told me she understood that I needed space and that she respected my boundaries. That word, boundaries, sounded rehearsed in her mouth. I wanted to believe her. Not because I trusted her fully, but because part of me was exhausted from suspicion. I didn't want every interaction to feel like a negotiation. I wanted peace, so I accepted the olive branch. That was my second mistake. Her visits resumed, but with subtle adjustments. She didn't ask for money right away. Instead, she asked questions, carefully chosen ones, questions that sounded harmless but carried weight. How secure do you feel financially? Do you have anyone advising you on this stuff? Have you thought about protecting what you built? She framed them as concern, as wisdom, as sisterly advice. And when I answered vaguely, she smiled and changed the subject, as if she were filing the information away for later. It took me time to realize what she was doing. She wasn't asking for help anymore. She was evaluating risk. Every conversation became an audit. She noticed patterns, tested reactions, measured how firm my boundaries really were. When I refused small favors, she didn't push, she observed. When I shared good news, she listened carefully, eyes sharp, absorbing details I hadn't intended to give. She was learning how to approach me differently. Instead of crises, she began using comparisons. Everyone else helps their family. I just thought we were closer than that. I'd never let you struggle alone. Each sentence was calibrated to trigger guilt without sounding accusatory, to make me question my values instead of her behavior, to shift the focus away from her entitlement and onto my supposed lack of compassion. I began noticing how she spoke about money in general, not just mine. She resented people who had it, mocked those who protected it, dismissed boundaries as selfishness disguised as responsibility. In her worldview, access was a moral right, and anyone who denied it was betraying the family. The pressure escalated gradually. She started mentioning long-term plans, things she wanted to do, things she deserved. She talked about how unfair life had been to her, how opportunities always seemed to land in other people's laps, especially mine. She never said I owed her. She didn't have to. One night, after a particularly long conversation, she sighed and said, "I don't know why things feel so different between us now." I told her the truth, calmly, carefully. I said I needed balance, that I couldn't be her safety net forever, that I wanted a relationship that wasn't built on obligation. Her expression changed instantly, not anger, not sadness, calculation. She nodded slowly, as if she understood. Then she said something that chilled me. "I just hope you don't regret this." At the time, I thought she meant emotionally. I thought she was warning me about distance, about losing connection. I didn't realize she was warning me about consequences. After that conversation, her behavior shifted again, this time more subtly than ever. She became polite, neutral, almost detached. She stopped sharing her problems, stopped asking for help. If I reached out, she responded briefly, cordially. From the outside, it looked like maturity. From the inside, it felt like a door closing. I later learned that while she was distancing herself from me, she was doing the opposite with everyone else. She began talking, quietly, selectively. She told relatives I had changed, that success had made me cold, that I was obsessed with money, that I thought I was better than everyone else. She framed herself as the concerned sibling, confused by my behavior, hurt by my withdrawal. She never mentioned the years of support, the sacrifices, the access she'd taken for granted. She only mentioned my refusal, and people listened because she sounded reasonable, calm, hurt. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. And disappointment, when performed correctly, is incredibly persuasive. I didn't know any of this at the time. I only felt the shift. Invitations stopped coming. Conversations grew awkward. Questions lingered in people's eyes when they looked at me. I was being redefined in rooms I wasn't present in. My sister had learned something important. If she couldn't control my resources, she could control the narrative. The first time I confronted her about the distance growing between us, she acted surprised. "I've just been giving you space," she said gently. I didn't want to pressure you. The irony was staggering. By then, I was constantly second-guessing myself, wondering if I had overreacted, if I really was being selfish, if protecting myself meant hurting others. That doubt, that erosion of confidence, was exactly what she wanted. Because leverage doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like reputation. Sometimes it looks like making you question your own memory. The turning point came when she asked for help again. This time, it wasn't money. It was access. She said she needed advice, guidance, someone to look over some things with her. She wanted my input on documents, on decisions, on finances that weren't mine, but that she wanted connected to me. The request was framed as collaboration, as trust, as reconciliation. But I could see it clearly now. She wasn't asking for help. She was asking for a foothold. And when I declined it calmly, firmly, without apology, something in her finally broke. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She smiled, and in that smile, I saw it for the first time. Resentment hardened into resolve. That was the moment our relationship crossed a line it would never come back from. Because once someone decides you are no longer useful, but still powerful, they don't try to win you back. They try to neutralize you. I didn't know how far she was willing to go. I didn't know what she was capable of. But I was about to learn that when help becomes leverage, and leverage turns into entitlement, the next step is punishment, and she was already planning mine. The punishment didn't arrive all at once. That's the mistake most people make when they imagine betrayal. They expect an explosion, a confrontation, raised voices, clear enemies. What I faced instead was far more dangerous. A quiet campaign carried out patiently behind closed doors with smiles and plausible deniability. After I refused her last request, my sister didn't contact me again. No angry messages, no accusations, no dramatic goodbyes, just absence. At first, I welcomed it. Silence felt safer than manipulation. I told myself that maybe this was how things healed: distance, time, space to cool down. I focused on my work, my routine, the parts of my life that felt stable and earned. But stability has a way of attracting attention from those who resent it. The first sign that something was wrong came from an unexpected place. A cousin I hadn't spoken to in months called me out of the blue. Her tone was careful, almost hesitant. "Are you okay?" she asked. It sounded like concern, but there was something else underneath it: doubt. I told her I was fine, better than fine. And then she paused before saying, "I'm glad. I just heard you've been under a lot of pressure lately." I asked what she meant. She hesitated again, then said, "Your sister mentioned you were struggling, that you'd been making risky choices, that you were overwhelmed." The words hit me harder than I expected. Not because they were true, they weren't, but because of how casually they were delivered. As if this version of me had already been accepted as fact. I corrected her gently, told her everything was under control, that there had been misunderstandings. She seemed relieved, but unconvinced. That conversation repeated itself again and again over the following weeks, with different voices and different phrasing. "You've been distant. She's worried about you. She says you've changed. She says money has gone to your head." Always the same pattern. Concern first, judgment second. Silence when I tried to explain. I began to understand what was happening. My sister wasn't attacking me directly. She was shaping perception, laying groundwork, creating a version of events where she was patient, loving, and concerned, and I was unstable, arrogant, and ungrateful. She never insulted me outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she asked questions about me, shared worries, expressed sadness about how money had come between us. She was planting seeds. And seeds don't need to be loud. They just need time. What made it worse was how believable she sounded. She knew how to perform sincerity. She spoke softly, avoided absolutes, framed everything as confusion, not accusation. I don't know what happened to them. I just want my sibling back. I hope they don't push everyone away. By the time I realized how far it had spread, the damage was already done. Invitations stopped. People I'd known my whole life became polite but distant. Conversations felt guarded. I could sense that I was being evaluated constantly, not for what I said, but for whether I matched the version of me they had already been given. I was no longer myself in their eyes. I was a rumor. The most painful part wasn't losing trust. It was losing context. No one asked me directly what was happening. They assumed that if something was wrong, it must be because I had done something wrong. Because why would a sister lie? I tried to confront her once, carefully. I asked if she had been talking about me. She looked genuinely surprised, offended, even. "I've only said good things," she replied. "I defend you all the time. I tell people you're just stressed." The denial was flawless. If I pushed, I looked paranoid. If I stayed quiet, the story continued without me. That's how quiet campaigns work. They put you in a position where defending yourself makes you look guilty. Meanwhile, the pressure wasn't just social. It was psychological. I began replaying old conversations in my head, questioning my tone, my decisions, my boundaries. I wondered if I really had been too harsh, too protective, too focused on myself. Gaslighting doesn't always come from one person directly telling you that you're wrong. Sometimes it comes from an entire environment slowly agreeing on a version of you that doesn't match who you are. I started documenting things, messages, dates, conversations, not because I planned to use them, but because I needed proof for myself. I needed to know that I wasn't imagining it. That instinct would later save me. The campaign escalated when money re-entered the picture, indirectly. I learned, through a mutual contact, that my sister had been telling people she was worried I was being financially manipulated, that I was surrounded by the wrong advisors, that I might be hiding losses. That was when I understood her endgame. She wasn't just trying to isolate me socially, she was undermining my credibility. If people believed I was reckless, unstable, or secretive, then any future move she made against me would seem justified. Necessary even. She was building a case, not in court yet, but in public opinion. The most dangerous lies are the ones that prepare others to accept worse lies later. I stopped engaging completely. No explanations, no corrections, no defenses. I focused on tightening my life, my records, my legal protections, my boundaries. It felt paranoid at the time. It was preparation. Because one afternoon, I received an email that changed everything. It wasn't from my sister. It was from a lawyer. The subject line was neutral, professional, almost polite. Notice of intent. I stared at the screen for a long time before opening it. The document inside was worse than anything I had imagined. It accused me of financial misconduct, claimed misuse of shared resources, suggested breach of trust. It referenced family obligations, verbal agreements, implied consent. It was written carefully, vaguely, strategically. There were no outright lies, just twisted interpretations and omissions. And at the bottom of the document was a name I recognized immediately. My sister. That was the moment the quiet campaign became open war. She wasn't asking anymore. She wasn't hinting. She was accusing. Everything she had been planting, every concern, every whisper, every expression of disappointment, now had a purpose. The narrative was ready. The audience was primed. If I fought back, I would be confirming the story unstable, defensive, ungrateful. If I stayed silent, I would lose everything. She had positioned herself as the victim and me as the threat. And the system, legal, social, familial, was built to protect people who look reasonable. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid of losing money, but because I realized something far more disturbing. My sister hadn't just been collecting resources, she had been collecting allies, collecting credibility, collecting patience. She had waited until the moment she believed I was isolated enough, doubted enough, softened enough, and then she struck. This wasn't impulse, this was strategy, and suddenly every memory made sense. The questions, the silence, the concern. I wasn't being punished for refusing her. I was being punished for surviving without her. As dawn broke, one truth became painfully clear. I wasn't just fighting a lawsuit. I was fighting a story, one she had been writing for years. And in the next chapter, I would have to decide whether I was willing to tear that story apart, even if it meant exposing everything she had tried so carefully to hide. Because the quiet campaign was over, and the real battle was about to begin. By the time the court date was set, the story had already been decided in most people's minds. Not officially, not legally, but socially. That was the brilliance of what my sister had done. The lawsuit wasn't meant to convince the judge alone, it was meant to confirm what everyone had already been prepared to believe. The legal action wasn't the beginning of the attack. It was the final act of a performance that had been rehearsed for years. I read the complaint line by line, over and over again. Every sentence was engineered to sound reasonable, measured, concerned. There were no dramatic accusations, no emotional language. Just patterns, concerns, and obligations. It painted a picture of someone who had been trusted too much and supervised too little. Someone like me, she claimed I had benefited from family support without accountability. That I had leveraged relationships for financial gain. That I had failed to honor understood agreements. None of it was backed by concrete proof because there was none, but the language itself was persuasive. It didn't need to be true. It only needed to sound familiar. I hired a lawyer the next morning, not because I thought I would lose, but because I knew how dangerous perception could be. My lawyer was calm, experienced, and immediately alert to the subtext. "This isn't about recovering money," he said after reviewing the documents. "This is about control and reputation." Hearing someone else say it out loud was strangely grounding. He asked me questions no one else had ever asked before. When did the pressure start? When did the requests escalate? Who else was involved? Who knows your financial history and why? As I answered, a timeline began to form, not just of events, but of intent. Patterns emerged. Moments I had dismissed as uncomfortable or awkward now revealed themselves as strategic. My sister hadn't acted impulsively. She had acted patiently. She had waited until my finances were strong enough to be worth taking and my social support thin enough to be ineffective. What terrified me most was how close she had come to succeeding. Because even now, part of me still felt guilty. That's what manipulation does. It doesn't just attack your resources. It attacks your sense of legitimacy. It makes you wonder if maybe you did owe something, if maybe boundaries were cruelty. If independence was betrayal. I had to unlearn that quickly. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the pressure intensified. People stopped calling entirely. Messages went unanswered. Invitations disappeared. I could feel the unspoken consensus forming. If this were truly unfair, surely someone would be defending you. But no one wanted to be wrong publicly. Supporting me meant risking their own credibility if I lost. And my sister knew that. She showed up everywhere I wasn't. Family gatherings, social events, community functions, always composed, always calm, always careful with her words. She never attacked me openly. She didn't have to. She simply looked tired, sad, burdened. "I just hope this doesn't tear the family apart," she would say, as if she weren't the one holding the knife. The night before the hearing, I barely slept. Not because I didn't trust the facts, but because I understood how fragile truth becomes once it enters a courtroom filtered through narrative. Facts need structure to survive, stories don't. I walked into the courthouse alone the next morning. No one sat beside me, no comforting messages, no quiet reassurances, just the echo of my footsteps and the weight of everything that had been said about me when I wasn't in the room. My sister arrived shortly after with support. She hugged people, accepted whispers of encouragement, thanked them for being there. She looked exactly like someone who had been wronged. She did not look at me. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was clinical, cold, neutral, which should have been reassuring, but neutrality favors the prepared. Her lawyer spoke first. He outlined the case smoothly, confidently. He referenced financial patterns, emotional distance, repeated attempts at reconciliation. He spoke as if he were narrating something inevitable. He framed my independence as defiance, my boundaries as secrecy, my silence as guilt. I watched the judge carefully as he listened. No reaction, no visible judgment, just notes. Then it was my lawyer's turn. He didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue emotionally. Instead, he began asking questions. Simple ones: dates, timelines, documentation, consistency. He asked my sister to clarify when certain agreements had been made. She answered vaguely. He asked if there were written records. She said no, they were understood. He asked who had benefited financially from the alleged arrangements. She said the family. He asked whether any money had been transferred directly to her accounts. She paused, just briefly, but long enough. The judge noticed. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but something shifted in the room. Not suspicion yet, curiosity. My lawyer continued. He introduced records, emails, messages. Notes I had kept without fully understanding why at the time, except that something felt wrong. Requests that escalated, conditions that changed. Concern that turned transactional. The tone of the courtroom changed with each piece of evidence. Not dramatically, incrementally, like pressure building. My sister's composure began to crack, not in anger, but in rigidity. Her answers became shorter, less fluid. The warmth drained from her performance. She was no longer narrating. She was responding. Then the judge spoke for the first time. He didn't address the lawyers. He addressed her. "I'd like clarification on one point," he said calmly. She straightened in her seat. "Yes, Your Honor." He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents in front of him. "You've described your actions as concern for your siblings' well-being," he said. "Yet the majority of your involvement appears to begin only after their financial independence." The room went completely still. He continued, "Can you explain why none of these concerns were formally raised before that point?" My sister opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced briefly at her lawyer. The judge waited. She tried again. "Well, it wasn't necessary at the time," she said. "Things changed." "How?" the judge asked. She hesitated. "Circumstances," she replied. The judge nodded slowly. "And one more question," he said, his voice steady. "If your primary motivation was protection rather than recovery, why did your legal actions seek total financial control rather than oversight this time?" There was no immediate answer, because there wasn't one, not a convincing one, anyway. I watched something collapse in real time, not the case, but the illusion. For the first time, the narrative she had so carefully constructed was being questioned, not emotionally, but logically. Concern doesn't escalate into domination. Protection doesn't require erasure. Silence filled the courtroom. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Ground. The judge didn't rule that day. He didn't need to. He requested additional documentation. Independent review. Financial transparency from both sides. That alone was enough, because the moment he asked those questions, the story changed. Not publicly yet, but irreversibly. Outside the courtroom, people avoided my eyes, uncertain now. The certainty they had relied on was gone. My sister walked past me without a word. Her mask hadn't shattered, but it had slipped. And once a mask slips, it never fits the same way again. As I stepped into the daylight, I understood something crucial. The battle wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. In the final chapter, everything she had hidden, every quiet manipulation, every collected favor, every calculated delay would be forced into the light. Because when stories collide with evidence, only one survives. And this time, it wouldn't be hers. The weeks that followed the hearing were the longest of my life, not because I didn't know what the truth was, but because truth, once exposed, doesn't rush. It moves carefully, methodically. It demands patience from the very people it has already wounded. The judge's request for further documentation changed everything. Suddenly, the burden of proof no longer rested quietly on my shoulders. It was shared, balanced, and for the first time since this ordeal began, my sister had something to lose. The independent financial review was thorough, relentless, impersonal in the best possible way. Bank records, timelines, correspondence, patterns of behavior, all examined without emotion or assumption. Numbers don't care about family narratives. They don't respond to guilt. They don't bend to entitlement. They simply reveal. As the review progressed, small inconsistencies began to surface. Not dramatic ones, not enough to make headlines, but enough to raise questions that could no longer be ignored. Why had my sister requested access to accounts she wasn't legally tied to? Why had her concerns only appeared after my income stabilized? Why were alleged obligations never documented, yet her requests always were? Each question chipped away at the image she had built so carefully. People began reaching out again, cautiously at first. Short messages, neutral tones, questions framed as concern rather than apology. I answered what I could. I no longer over-explained. I no longer tried to convince. I let the process speak. The hardest part wasn't the legal tension. It was the emotional fallout. Because when someone betrays you slowly, methodically, with intention, there's no single moment to grieve. There's no clear before and after. Instead, you mourn in fragments. I grieved a sibling I thought I had. I grieved a version of myself who believed love was unconditional. I grieved the years I spent explaining myself to people who had already decided who I was. But grief has a strange clarity to it. It forces you to ask difficult questions, not about them, but about yourself. Why did I tolerate the pressure for so long? Why did I confuse access with affection? Why did I believe that setting boundaries made me cruel? The answers weren't flattering. They rarely are. I had been taught, quietly and consistently, that my worth was tied to usefulness. That generosity was an obligation. That refusal was betrayal. And my sister had understood that lesson perfectly. The final court session arrived quietly. No crowd, no tension in the hallway. Just paperwork, process, and resolution. The judge was direct. He acknowledged the emotional complexity of family disputes, then made it clear that emotion does not override evidence. He stated plainly that the claims against me were unsupported, that the legal action had overreached, that the narrative presented did not align with the financial reality. The case was dismissed. There was no dramatic reaction. No shedding, no tears, just finality. My sister sat still as the ruling was read. Her expression unreadable, not angry, not remorseful. Simply closed. She didn't look at me. I didn't expect her to, because accountability rarely arrives with apologies. Outside the courtroom, there were no reunions, no sudden realizations, just space. And space, I learned, is sometimes the greatest gift truth can give you. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. There was no public reckoning. No family meeting where everything was laid bare. People adjusted their beliefs privately, slowly, without announcements. Some relationships returned, changed, but functional. Others faded completely. I didn't chase any of them. I had learned something essential. Not every loss is a tragedy. Some losses are corrections. My sister and I no longer speak. Not because I'm angry, though I was, for a long time, but because clarity changes what you're willing to tolerate. I no longer confuse shared history with shared values. And she, I suspect, no longer sees me as useful, which is exactly how it should be. The experience changed how I move through the world. I document, I clarify, I ask questions early. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. I no longer give without understanding why I'm being asked. I no longer accept concern that arrives with conditions. And I no longer shrink myself to preserve someone else's comfort. If there is a lesson in all of this, it's not about money. It's about power. Power hides behind familiarity. It disguises itself as love. It thrives in silence and expectation. And it collapses when asked to explain itself clearly. My sister wasn't visiting me. She was collecting leverage, collecting narrative, collecting control. And when she could no longer collect, she tried to punish. She failed not because I fought harder, but because I stopped playing the role she needed me to play. The truth didn't set me free in one dramatic moment. It freed me gradually. By removing illusions, by exposing patterns, by demanding boundaries and freedom, I've learned, doesn't always feel like relief at first. Sometimes it feels like emptiness, but emptiness is honest, and from that honesty, I built something stronger than what I lost. A life that no longer needs permission to exist. A future that isn't available for collection. And a peace that came at a cost, but was worth every single thing it took to earn it. If this story touched something deep inside you, don't stay silent. So many people suffer quietly because the pain comes from the ones who were supposed to protect them. If you've ever felt used, manipulated, or betrayed by someone you trusted, you're not alone. Leave a comment with your story or simply write "I understand." Your voice matters here. Like this video to help others find it. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories that expose the truths people are afraid to talk about. Because healing begins when the truth is finally spoken.